Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Your heart was tired, feared the worst and felt the fire. Lay it all down, lay it all find you in the doubt, and to know you is to love you, and to know so little else. I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you. Lord, I find you in the morning, Lord, I seek you every day. Let my life be for your glory, woven in your threads of grace. I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you. Go where you shine, break the dawn. Way right before me, light. All I need is you. Oh, light, glorious light, I will go where you shine, break the dawn, crack the skies, make the way bright before me. In your light, I will find all I need. All I need is you. Oh, light, glorious light, I will go where you shine, break the dawn, crack the skies, make the way bright before me. In your light, I will find all I need. All I need is you. Oh, light, glorious light, I will go where you shine, break the dawn, crack the skies, make the way bright before me. In your light, I will find all I need. All I need is you. Lord, I find you in the seeking. Lord, I find you in the doubt, and to know you is to love you, and to know so little else. I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you. Oh, how I need you.
Hey Crosspointe, it's good to be with you today. I want to let you know about a few upcoming events. One, next Sunday, October 9th, we won't be having our typical Sunday gatherings, either in person or online. Instead, we're going to have a day of service. Now, if you can join us in person in Cary, North Carolina, we're going to be partnering with the organization Rise Against Hunger with the goal of packaging 40,000 meals that will be distributed throughout the world to administer school feeding programs, orphanages, health clinics, and in response to different crises. So we're going to be doing this from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. next Sunday, October 9th, in our main auditorium. It's an event where all ages are invited to participate. So in light of that, we won't be having our regular children's and student programming. Instead, kids and students are all invited to serve with the adults in the auditorium, as there will be opportunities for every age to participate. But for our littlest ones, the YMCA will be providing childcare for infants up to 3 years old if you do want to take advantage of that option. And you can drop them off for part of the time or all of that time. Now, if you can't be with us in person that day and you're joining with us online from somewhere across the world, you're invited to participate in this day of service as well. Starting today, you can go to crosspointe.org/serveday, and it will give you some ideas and options that you can participate in wherever you live across the world. You can access that list of ideas now, and you can plan ahead for next Sunday, or we'll be providing a brief video prompt on Sunday, October 9th, to point you toward different ways that you can participate. Next. Now, it's no surprise for any of us who are parents or who interact with kids and teens on a regular basis that the last few years have produced extremely high levels of anxiety, stress, and depression in our young people. So, we want to provide some help and wisdom. Next Tuesday evening, October 11th, we're going to be hosting our next parenting lab online via Zoom. We've invited an expert, Heather Hale, who is a child, adolescent, and family therapist, to join us to discuss how we can recognize the signs of anxiety and depression in our kids and the steps that we can take to prioritize our children's mental health. Now, Heather's going to be offering 2 sessions for us, one from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. She's going to focus primarily on depression and anxiety in children. And then from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, she's going to focus primarily on depression and anxiety in teens. Now, while some of the information will be the same, you're welcome to join us for both sessions or just attend one, whatever works out best for you. Crosspointe's covering the cost of this event, so it's completely free to you. And if you're a parent, I can't think of a more important thing to invest your time and energy in right now than better equipping yourself to help your child navigate their own mental health better. So, all you need to do is go to crosspointe.org/parentinglabs to register, and after you register, the Zoom link will be sent to you. And then, one more event to make note of. Crosspointe is participating in the Evolving Faith Conference, October 14th and 15th. Our teacher in residence, Jeff Chu, is the co-leader of this global event. And if you've missed the invitation that he personally shared last week online, go back to last week's video and you can watch it there. But as Jeff describes it, the Evolving Faith Conference creates space for those of us who can't seem to let go of the Jesus story, but also have a lot of questions and doubts about some of the things we were taught and told about the Bible, about God, about the church, and how the church makes its way through the world. There's going to be about 40 speakers and artists from across the world that are going to be leading at this 2-day online event. You can watch it live on those 2 days, October 14th and 15th, or once you register, you'll have access to all the video content through the end of the year that you can watch on demand. Jeff has arranged a generous discount for anyone from Crosspointe who wants to participate in the conference. So if you'd like to access that discount and learn more about the conference, go to crosspointe.org/evolvingfaith. And then lastly, as we invite you to do every week, if you want to help fund all that Crosspointe is doing, events like all of these I just mentioned, as well as all the programming, the mentoring, the helping people through crisis, the financial assistance to those in need throughout our city, the operations that make it all possible, you can go to crosspointe.org/contribute. And you can contribute via card, check, PayPal, text, stocks, however you want. Because who Crosspointe is and what we do together is only possible when we leverage our generosity together to see more good done in the world. Now, at the end of Tears' teaching today, she's going to lead us into a time of communion. So for those of you who would like to participate, we're going to give you 2 minutes now to go and get some supplies for a communion meal that we'll share together at the end of her teaching. Maybe get some type of bread or cracker or some type of drink, whether that's juice, wine, water, whatever you have access to. So we're going to put a countdown timer on the screen, and feel free to use that time now. Your love, Crosspointe.
So I have really been struck by stories of perseverance lately. Stories from Ukraine, both individuals, neighbors, strangers, continuing day after day to fight for their autonomy, for their freedom, for their lives against much larger world superpower. Individuals choosing to leave the familiar and hopefully find safer lives in strange places. People who have chosen to stay behind in war zones to continue to work and educate and try to offer a semblance of normalcy for those still in their communities. Active perseverance in the face of extreme adversity. I've been reminded of the stories of the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, in Durham, not that far from us, and across the country during the Civil Rights Movement. In February 1960, just 18 minutes from the Crosspointe building in downtown Durham, 17 Black college students staged peaceful sit-ins at 3 lunch counters. They pledged to stay there until Blacks were served. They read, they studied, they ordered food, they sat peacefully and quietly. Waitresses refused them, stores closed, bomb threats were called in to keep them out. They were abused by patrons, but their sit-ins encouraged similar peaceful attempts all across the country. And they were the beginning of a 4-year nationwide effort. And in 1964, 4 years after their first lunch sit-in, lunch counters across the country were desegregated. It was the power of silent perseverance. I mean, even NASA named their Mars rover Perseverance, which could be seen as either positive or ominous. I mean, maybe they named it that preemptively because they'd already felt things were going to go wrong. Maybe it's a reminder of how long we've been at this space thing. Maybe it's simply encouraging and inspirational. Regardless, naming $1 billion Mars rover Perseverance is itself an act of long-term, hopeful perseverance. The American Heritage Dictionary defines perseverance as to persist in or remain constant to a purpose, idea, or task in the face of obstacles or discouragement. So in other words, perseverance is more than just hanging on for dear life, because tenacity can only get us so far. Eventually, our arms are going to give out. Perseverance has roots and goals, even if the goal is only to make it to the next day. Interestingly, the words perseverance and resistance are semantically related, and in some cases you can actually interchange them. Resistance is defined as the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument, or the ability not to be affected by something, especially adversely. Actions in Ukraine and at lunch counters could be called and have been called acts of resistance. And it's been said that perseverance is the greatest form of resistance, because perseverance continues on with a singular focus, resisting outside forces. Bring it on, world. I will just keep going. When perseverance is practiced, it is, in essence, resisting the urge to give up. It's climbing uphill when everything in our body says to turn back. Hypothetically, swimming against the current when it makes sense to just go with the flow or stop swimming altogether. And in these situations, perseverance reminds us of all the things that could be lost if we do give up. And while thinking about perseverance, I was reminded this week of 2 texts in the Gospel of Luke, stories we have about Jesus. Both stories of women, the author identifies them as widows. The writer of Luke has a special focus on women and the poor and children and the widows, justice for those considered less powerful. So it's not surprising that both of these stories are located in this book just a few chapters apart. They're neighbors. And I don't know about you, but when I think of biblical widows, my brain almost always goes Disney, meaning I think elderly, frail, incredibly vulnerable women, physically, emotionally, socially. For some reason, in my mind, they're usually wearing a gray hooded cape in my mind. And in many cases, this may have been accurate. minus the cape. However, biblical widows wouldn't necessarily have always been elderly. Because women were typically married to older men, sometimes much older, and because lifespans were considerably shorter than they are today, it was possible for women to be widowed at a young age. Women during this time, including widows, were definitely more vulnerable in society. They were more susceptible to exploitation. They lived within a patriarchal structure, which meant they had less rights, less access, and there was little that they could do to support themselves, to defend themselves. The system in place was oppressive. Women who were married or lived with their families usually had male protectorates. Because exploitation of widows was so common, there were many Jewish laws that were aimed to protect them, including one that prohibited taking a widow's garment in pledge. And this meant literally taking the last shirt off her back as payment. And even widows with wealth or familial power, they were in danger of exploitation too, perhaps even more so sometimes, because opportunists had more to take from them and more motivation. Which is why there's so many directives throughout the biblical books that say we should take care of widows and orphans and refugees. They had lost their protectors, their safety net. Taking care of these vulnerable populations was serious business. It wasn't just legal business. It was theological. It was religious business. Widows were not, however, always powerless. Often in the biblical narratives, it's the widows who are the loudest advocates and the ones who fight the hardest for justice. Often because they've been forgotten or left out, or because people refuse to fight for them and they're forced to stand up for themselves. I want us to keep these things in mind as we look at the text. The first story in Luke chapter 18, we read this. Jesus said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. There was a widow in that city, and she came to him continually and saying, 'Grant me justice against my accuser,' or my adversary. And he was not willing for some time. But later he said to himself, 'Though I do not fear God or respect anyone else, yet because this widow persists in troubling me, I will grant her justice so that she may not ultimately come to violence against me.'" This nameless woman is simply identified as a widow. We don't know who she was before this became her sole identity, if she had status, if she had wealth, although we do know that going to court would likely have cost quite a bit of money. It seems her accuser, her adversary, was likely an exploitive male oppressor, probably a plaintiff in some sort of legal case, who had brought a complaint against her, probably a false one, because they were probably not giving her what was legally due to her as a widow. And so, having exhausted all of their avenues, the widow goes to an apparently often unresponsive and very self-assured judge who boisterously announces that he doesn't care what anyone says, it is his courtroom and he did things his way. So implied here is that this judge is either ignorant of the laws prohibiting the exploitation of widows or that he doesn't care. Now, this could also mean that he typically didn't allow his judgments to be swayed by any outside forces, including the divine, or that he was simply a narcissistic jerk. And it's likely the latter. And unfortunately, the English translations don't give us the parable punchline that Jesus did. The judge hints that not only is he annoyed at this persevering widow, he's a bit afraid of her. This judge, who has self-proclaimed that he neither fears people nor God, expresses fear of this woman who society has labeled a most vulnerable person. The language here in this verse, "I will grant her justice so that she may not ultimately come to violence against me," hints at potential violence, and translated literally is, I, meaning the judge, I'm going to grant her justice so that she will not blacken my eye, or so that she will not give me a blow to the face. This is a little more than just threatened violence. This indicates more than just a nagging, harmless woman. She's given this judge an ultimatum because she's come so many times. Grant me justice or else. Perhaps the judge is concerned about his personal safety, but perhaps he's less concerned about what a black eye would do to his body than he is what a black eye would do to his reputation, because black eyes are a bit difficult to hide, and they tend to last a while. And you tend to want a story behind where they came from. And I'm sure his friends and colleagues would have happily pointed out a shiner given to him by a helpless woman. And regardless of physical or reputational motivation, the widow who persevered received her justice. This is a woman who had been abandoned by failed laws, by failed systems, and she took justice into her own hands. And the text tells us clearly about the widow's perseverance. It says she kept coming, and she kept saying, she kept demanding to be heard and for action to be taken. And when the system said women in her position should be quiet, she demanded to be listened to. And when the system said her vulnerable position meant she had no voice, she insisted upon her voice being heard. The community had seen her repeatedly coming to court. The community had heard the things she had said to and about a certain unresponsive judge. The widow had been a victim of her accuser, but she would not fall victim to the judge. And we find that her perseverance pays off. And just a note here, don't hear me condoning threats of violence as a means to an end. Rather, hear me pointing out the power of perseverance and resourcefulness, and the power of a persevering voice. Because this woman's perseverance was an act of resistance against a false accusation, against a system that didn't care about her well-being, against a lack of an advocate, against a selfish judge. It appears this judge had woefully misjudged this woman. And perhaps the judge listened more closely to the next widow who came into his courtroom. It was active perseverance. Well, a few chapters later, in Luke chapter 21, Jesus and his disciples were sitting at the temple. They were people watching. And as they sat, they saw teachers of the law, religious leaders, people who knew big and important things. And Jesus commented on them to his disciples. And he says in Luke 20:46, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses for show, make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Now, Jesus had nothing against teachers. He had nothing against those who hold power. What he did have a problem with was exploitation and unfair systems. He did not condone leaders acting like the very worst versions of politicians and calling it spirituality. Outwardly kissing babies, getting invited to all the important events, being greeted by everybody who is anybody, while offering their long acceptance speeches. Behind the scenes, they were devouring, they were eating up, they were consuming the lives and literal homes of others and leaving them destitute and homeless, becoming wealthier and more powerful on the backs of the most vulnerable, when they had been championed with the job of keeping those people safe. And as Jesus and his disciples watched, they saw these esteemed men come to the treasury, located in the outer area of the temple, a place where larger crowds would have been. The temple tax system at that time was set up so that the poor had to give way beyond their means in order to fulfill the requirements. The powerful used their influence to exploit those with the least. You might imagine a television preacher reaching through the screen, asking for a sacrificial giving as an act of faith, but at the cost of someone's necessary medical procedure or food for somebody's children. Additionally, the funds that these men were asking for were supposed to be used to care for those with less. They were instead being used to line pockets and to fund pet projects. The best had been redirected toward themselves. And as Jesus and his disciples sat in the religious building, they observed people putting money into the treasury. The teachers of the law paraded in. They came in their expensive robes, through crowds of the religiously devout. They dropped large amounts of money into the treasuries, and they were listening to the clatter of the coins as they rattled around, and they smiled and they blew kisses at their fan base. Jesus and his disciples continued to watch. And here's what the text says. Jesus looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins, and he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all she had to live on." Jesus drew attention to the one person nobody was noticing. Behind the flowing robes of the wealthy baby kissers was another nameless woman. She's given 2 descriptors, poor and widow. And from the last story about the widow, we know what those 2 things mean. This woman was one who had had her home devoured by the system, a direct recipient of the exploitation of the men she was now behind in the offering line. For the disciples, Jesus' words just got real. They now had a face. And it's funny how we seem to find more compassion when we have a face to put to the issues, isn't it? In Jesus' commentary, it's not one that implies that the rich should be shamed for giving abundantly, nor that widows shouldn't be celebrated for giving from their hearts. His message wasn't about the amount given at all. Jesus wasn't praising the fact that the woman gave everything. This is not the moral of the story. Jesus was lamenting a system that required that this poor widow, someone who should have been protected and cared for, felt compelled to give more than she could afford, while those with abundance were not bothered to realize or take action against the system, a system that they had created and that had left her destitute. And they were all dropping their money into the same treasury. Jesus was condemning the value system that created the situation in the first place. The woman had felt it important to be faithful in her support of the temple. It was her tangible act of love to her God, even though she had little. But the religious system had devoured her to the point of only having 2 pennies left to her name. But let's not think that this woman's penny donation was only a passive action at all. Because according to the temple law, the woman didn't have to give both of her coins. Doing so was a type of quiet resistance, of perseverance. Her actions were one of defiance. This was a woman with nothing else to lose. The system had already taken everything she held dear. Her husband, her security, her home, her means of living. They may as well take the rest. Her life was the definition of perseverance. She still woke up. She got dressed. She came to the temple. She would honor her God and offer a gift. But what God required and what the leaders required were not the same thing. And the people there would know that human leadership asked her for something that was not being given without consequence. Her giving both coins was an act of resistance. The widow giving all that she had would likely not have been recognized by anyone else other than those watching that day if Jesus hadn't pointed her out. I imagine her making eye contact with the baby kissers as she dropped the last of her savings into the treasury, it making 2 echoey clinks and it landed on the top of a large deposit that was already there. And her 2 pennies may not have gotten her invitations to dinner or her name on a plaque or a building, but by scale, they were worth an induction into the Hall of Fame. Everyone who was anyone in the temple knew what her gift really meant. Giving everything was a last act of resistance. Perhaps the religiously powerful listened more closely to the coins the next widow dropped into the treasury. Or perhaps it changed to nothing with the disciples. These 2 women had very different acts of perseverance, of resistance. Both pushed back against unjust systems. Both moved forward when everything seemed to tell them to turn back, to give less, to give up. One spoke persistently and loudly, and one didn't utter a word. And I don't know what that means for us today, other than to call us toward our own perseverance and resistance. To call us to not give up when things that are worth fighting for get difficult. Sometimes this may mean active perseverance, like the first widow, using our voices to stand up to be heard, calling us, like Jesus did the disciples, to notice the nameless who are victims of systems that require more of them than is just, fair, or equitable. Perhaps it's a call to more quiet perseverance, like the second widow. Sometimes just getting up and continuing on is perseverance enough for one day. Sometimes continuing to love and forgive when it is difficult is all the perseverance we have in us right now. Paul said in his letter to the church at Galatians, a church who was dealing with a lot of hard things, "Do not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Do not become weary. There are so many things that can make us weary. In our own lives, in our community, just turning on the news. And like the widows, we are called to be a persevering people. We are called to continue pursuing what is good for ourselves and for those around us. We're also told that we don't have to do it alone. Do not become weary. We might add to that, reach out to others when we feel weary. Like the students at the lunch counters in Durham, perseverance, resistance, it's easier with others by your side. Maybe not easier, but it's less lonely. Jonathan, Jennifer, and I were told this week by an incredible human who does some incredible work in Raleigh with marginalized communities that often it's not enough just to be allies. We must become accomplices, because allies get to come and go and walk away when they need to, but accomplices have skin in the game. And I think that's a great example of what corporate perseverance looks like. So today, we're going to participate in communion. Participating in communion, or maybe you've heard it called Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, it's a type of perseverance, of resistance. It's a call for corporate remembrance, but also a refusal to forget. It's an act calling us to remember the life of the one who persevered in love and compassion and who pursued peace. And it's a refusal to forget what the life of Jesus meant. An invitation into a new way of thinking and living, a way that does not honor power and wealth above everything else. Radical hospitality, a way that does not glorify systems of injustice and inequality. Jesus, who pointed out the perseverance of widows and encourages us to do the same. And the early practice of communion, the Lord's Supper, was originally a feast, one shared in community. A feast is where everyone comes, regardless of where they came from, where they've been, where they were going. A feast is where you have to look one another in the eye, where you serve one another and encourage one another in the way of Christ, where your story is known. It is a way of persevering love regardless of outside forces. And Jesus asked the community to eat the bread as a reminder of his body, to drink the wine as a reminder of his blood, not in some sort of cannibalistic way, but as a refusal to forget what his life meant and could mean. So communion, taken as acts of perseverance and resistance, remind us to plant our feet in the example of Christ, that we are not alone. We should not become weary in seeking what is good, that we can be renewed. So where are areas in our lives that need to be in with perseverance? Where do we need to be reminded to continue on? Where is perseverance your act of resistance? And as we take communion together, we're going to watch a video, and we're invited to remember that Christ asked us to remember his body and his blood and his love. And as you take communion today, reflect on where you are, where you want to be. Refuse to forget. Be reminded that you are loved. You're invited to love. Be invited to persevere wherever you are.
Behold, I make all things new. Behold, I make all things new. Behold, I make all things new. Let there be light. Let there be light. God unseen is taking form. God unseen is taking form. God unseen is taking form. Let there be life. Let there be life. The first and last is surging forth. The first and last is surging forth. The first and last is surging forth, becoming life, becoming life.
brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. And may God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love.
My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. And may God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. Bring me a higher love. Bring me a higher love. Oh, bring me a higher love. It's that higher love I've been thinking of.
My brother, my sister, God love you, God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love.
Bring me a higher love. Bring me a higher love. Oh, bring me a higher love. Yes, it's that higher love I've been thinking of. Bring me a higher love. Bring me a higher love. Oh, bring me a higher love. It's that higher love I've been thinking of.
My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. My brother, my sister, God love you and God bless you. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love. May God hold us all in those almighty hands of love.
If you would like to know more or get connected to Crosspointe, go to crosspointenc.org. If you're in need of care or assistance, go to crosspointe.org/care. And welcome home.